In this video, we'll cover DevSuite requirements management and best practices, starting with folder organization. In DevSuite, we will often do work between our modules, such as DevSpec, where we track requirements and specifications, DevTrack, where we track development issues and tasks, and DevTest, where we track testing library base as well as test execution. It's often asked by our customers what our recommended folder structure is and best practices, so I'd like to cover that here. Starting out in DevSpec, you have requirement spaces, which generally correspond to your product or projects. So in this example, we have something called Content Sharing Manager. If you were to want to create a new requirement space or development space, you would click at the root level of requirements, right-click and click New Requirement Space. Give it a product name or project name and click Submit, and then you have it in your folder structure. From here, you can map to DevTrack and DevTest, but for the sake of example here, I'll use the Content Sharing Manager. Below Content Sharing Manager, you can see here in DevSpec that you also have some subfolders, and in this case, those would generally correspond to components for that particular product or project, and that is our best practice. You then want to go into the other modules and ensure that you have the same folder structure. So you would go into DevTrack, ensure you have that same Content Sharing Manager structure established, and then also ensure that in DevTest library base you have that same Content Sharing Manager structure established. And as you can see here, you have the same subfolder component structure that was set up in DevSpec as well. Establishing this mapping ensures that you, for example, in DevTrack, that you're only working on requirements or specifications for that particular product. To establish the mapping between the requirement space in DevSpec and the development space in DevTrack, you would start out in DevSpec, right-click on that Content Sharing Manager or product folder, click Edit. Under the Linked Spaces tab, you would then click Select and ensure that you have the correct development space called Content Sharing Manager selected in DevTrack, and then click OK. It'll then show in the Linked Development Spaces section in this window, and then click Submit. Once you have that established between DevSpec and DevTrack, you can take it a step further and map that same folder structure into DevTest. So within DevTrack, you would right-click on that Content Sharing Manager folder, click Edit. There's a Space Links tab, which then shows you the corresponding mapping that was already done from DevSpec, showing the Content Sharing Manager. But then also on the right, you have a Link Test Template space, which then links into DevTest. You would click Select on the right in a similar way, select the Test Library Base space in DevTest, also called Content Sharing Manager, and click Submit. And it's as simple as that. You've then established a mapping or linking between the requirement space in DevSpec, the development space in DevTrack, and the corresponding test library base space within DevTest.